It says it's setting up our meeting for YouTube Live.
All right.
That one. You guys should start.
Yeah.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Marlo Daly Galliano from the Division of Humanities at Lewis Clark State College, and I'm so happy to welcome you to this session, which kicks off our programming for Black History Experience at LC State. We acknowledge that we all gather today on Indigenous homelands. At LC State in Seminicum, Lewiston, on the Indigenous homelands of the Nimipu Nez Perce tribe. We acknowledge the Nimipu as original caretakers since time immemorial and recognize their continuing connection to the land, to the water, and to their ancestors. We wish to take this opportunity to express our deepest appreciation and respect for the ongoing relationship built between Lewis Clark State College and the Nez Perce tribe. Ketsiao, thank you. And we'd like to thank you for attending this Black History Experience event at LC State. The Black History Experience at LC State seeks to offer a safe, welcoming, and inclusive space for learning and sharing, guided by the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We hope that you will actively seek to challenge any personal biases, assumptions, and preconceived stereotypes, and approach differences with openness and curiosity. We are very excited about the events we have put together to celebrate the Black History Experience. I'd like to thank my fellow committee members, Dr. Sarah Graham, Amy Minervini, and Jada Wims, and our sponsor, the Rose Hill Estate. Thank you for being here today as we amplify Black voices and learn about equity, wellness, and action with our special guest, Dianne Bondy. In addition to today's talk, I'd like to invite you to the session Dianne will be offering tomorrow at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. That session will be a Yoga for All class designed for people of all levels of fitness and experience. And like today's session, it will be streamed and available for later viewing at the LCSE Humanities Division YouTube page. And now I'm so happy to be able to tell you a little about our presenter. I've been following her for quite a while, so it is so exciting to be able to learn from her alongside all of you. Dianne Bondy is a social justice activist, author, accessible yoga teacher, and the leader of the Yoga for All movement. Her inclusive approach to yoga empowers anyone to practice, regardless of their shape, size, ethnicity, or level of ability. Dianne is revolutionizing yoga by educating yoga instructors around the world on how to make their classes welcoming for all kinds of practitioners. Dianne is the author of the international best-selling book, Yoga for Everyone, and co-author of Yoga Where You Are, or Yoga Where You Are. She has been featured in publications such as The Guardian, Huffington Post, Cosmopolitan, Mashable, and People. There will be time for questions at the end of this afternoon's talk. Please place questions in the YouTube chat, or if that isn't working, as is sometimes the case, you can email them to Sarah Graham at sjgraham@lcsc.edu. That's sjgraham@lcsc.edu. Dianne, it is such a pleasure to welcome you virtually to LC State.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited to come here and share with you my personal experience and my thoughts on how we create more diverse and equitable spaces, not only in wellness, but in everything that we do. But first, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement to the, I'm here on the unceded land of the Algonquin Nation here in Tecumseh, Ontario, Canada. I should let you know that when I speak about diversity, equity, and I'm actually moving away from the word inclusivity or inclusiveness. more and focusing more on equity. I want to tell you why in a minute, but we'll get to that in a minute. But I'm really excited to be here with you and kind of tell you a little bit about my journey. I started practicing yoga when I was 3 years old. My mother, who was a new immigrant to Canada, was at home without a car in a brand new town with 3 children under the age of 4 when my dad went off to work. And she needed a way to find some way to de-stress and to connect with her breath because she couldn't leave 4 kids. We didn't have any family. We didn't have any support systems. And she was under a great deal of stress. And she had purchased a book when she was studying to be a nurse in England called Stay Young with Yoga. I think I have it somewhere on my bookshelf. And she started kind of just going through the book and picking poses that she could do and exercises that she could do when her children were sleeping because she didn't have any childcare. She was home by herself. And my mother knew the value of self-care. And I've always been raised to take some time out to pay attention to how I was feeling. And I was introduced to yoga really early on as a child in order to help me to navigate the world. And at first it was just a little bit of exercise that my mom needed. And I was a precocious 3-year-old, so I wouldn't give her time to herself. So she figured she would take that time to herself by incorporating me into the practice. And that's how I learned yoga. And we used to practice together right until I went away to college. And then I went away to university and I got distracted by a lot of things going on in university, like a heavy schedule at school, the first time living away from home, and all the things that happen when you're in a new city, doing a new thing, changing, your life perspective by going off to school. And so yoga kind of fell out of the mix. And I kind of dropped out of the practice, started participating in other types of movement modalities. But what has always been consistent is I always would either come back to my meditation or come back to a little bit of my yoga practice here and there, but kind of sporadically. And then when I started a really difficult job, I remember at the time I was newly married and my husband said to me, you know what? If we want to stay married, you're going to have to learn how to manage your stress. And he encouraged me to go back to my yoga practice. And when I came back to my yoga practice as an adult, had finished, university, had a full-time job, was living my adult life, it had a very different connotation for me. The yoga practice I wanted to know more about. I wanted to know more than just the physicality, because here in the West, we primarily focus on the physicality of the yoga practice, detached from any of its lineage, detached from any of its origins. And so I wanted to learn something more. So I started researching yoga. I started reading about yoga. My mom gifted me the book that she had, and I wanted to dig deeper and not just have my practice be something that was about me, about sensory experiences, that was a very individualized practice, because I learned very early on that yoga meant unity. And I knew that it was, for me, a unity with my body and my breath, but on the larger scale or in the larger context of the world, it means unity among people, unity among our practice, unity in figuring out that we can see the humanity in each other. And that's what I came to understand as I began to practice as an older adult. When I was younger, it was just really fun to spend time with my mom. And that was a great way for us to bond. And it was a great way for me to learn how to be in my body. It was a great way for my mother to blow off stress. And it was just some fun I was having with my mom. And then as I got older and began to understand more about the practice, take up a meditation practice, I understood there was so much more about it that wasn't being shared or wasn't being seen. And when I started teaching yoga, I was a fitness instructor before I came to teach yoga. My yoga practice was always something that I just did for myself. And when I started practicing yoga or teaching yoga, it was really much in a fitness space. And what my boss at the time at the gym asked me to do was to teach a stretch class. People who were athletes needed a stretch class. And I thought to myself, I'm going to teach them yoga. I'm going to teach them how to breathe and move together. So I created this practice that we called stretch class. And folks were really very interested in it and really excited about it. But it wasn't until I would say about 1992 when Madonna, of all things, started talking about yoga in a public space, when it became something really interesting that celebrities did I see an influx of folks coming into the yoga space that was much different than before. Yoga had become this new cool thing that everyone was doing. And we had moved from like a high impact way of moving our bodies into something that was a little bit more connected, a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit more intentional. And it was then that I learned about making peace with my body, finding ways to distress, finding ways to reach out to different communities. And what I began to notice as a yoga teacher was that I was often the only person of color in the room, and then being a teacher on top of that. And it was really kind of discouraging and isolating to me not to see other folks of color in class. And I was wondering what was keeping folks of color out of the yoga class. Was it the philosophy? Was it where these yoga classes were held? Was it the time of day these yoga classes were held? And the more I started to teach and the more I started to take classes, the less I started to see people who looked like me, people in larger bodies, people with disabilities. I wasn't seeing anything but this very stereotypical, homogeneous yoga population that aligned itself very clearly or very closely with conventional European beauty standards. And that yoga had become this practice that was about body beautiful and less about connection and self-study and learning about something bigger than ourselves. And that kind of started my journey. I had come home from a yoga class shortly after my second son was born. I needed to get out of the house. So my husband said, why don't you go out and take a yoga class? And prior to that, I had only been practicing at home. I only had a home practice. I was pretty much self-taught from my mother and books I had read. And I went to a yoga studio. And when I walked up to the front desk, the person who was signing folks into the class gave me the once over, looked me up and down and said to me, you know, this is going to be hard, right? Like taking a judgment of my body. And what I had learned from my own studies, my practice with my mom, my understanding of yoga was that we weren't in judgment of each other. We were in community with each other. And it was really hard. If I hadn't had a yoga practice prior to that moment, I probably never would have gone back to that yoga class because I was really made to feel like I didn't belong there. And this was a short form Ashtanga class. And now I wasn't an Ashtanga practitioner and I hadn't studied in the lineage of Ashtanga. So when I went to class and I didn't quite understand the flow, the teacher at the front of the room made me feel like I had no right to be there. They were very angry with me being there in terms of I wasn't able to keep up. I was 6 weeks postpartum. I was really struggling through this practice because that wasn't what I expected the yoga practice to be. And so I was very upset and put off. And I ended up coming home and telling my husband, I'm going to open a yoga studio. And he was like, wait, what? I sent you off to take a few moments to yourself, and now you've come back and you're opening a yoga studio. But what I have found as a Black woman, and what I have found as a person of color in traditionally underestimated and historically excluded population, that when we don't feel like we belong in a space, we often create our own spaces. And you may have heard people say, when you don't, get a seat at the table, bring your own chair or create your own table. And if you look at the history of Black folks in North America, because I'm in Canada, I'm going to speak to a global experience because I'm not African-American. I can't speak to the African-American experience, but I can speak to the experience of being Black in a country that is white dominated, in a country that is Eurocentric, in a country where I am an underestimated population. And that is the intersection in which I can approach what it looks like here. What happens in Canada happens in America. What happens in America happens in Canada. I know that people have this utopian idea that Canada is this place where there's no racism and no discrimination and no bias. We do have socialized medicine. We do have a lot of things, but a lot of those old ideas from European colonialism also exist here and also keep certain populations at a disadvantage. So I'll be speaking from that perspective. And even in my history, I'm from the Caribbean. My family is from the Caribbean. even in my own history as a person who comes from a culture of the Caribbean, we've always been told that if you don't see it, create it. And as a person from Barbados, I guess our biggest, most current pop cultural example of that would be the newly pregnant Rihanna, who built a whole empire, was one of the first people or makeup lines to create shades of foundation in 30 or 40 shades to start. Can you even imagine what it is like to go into your local Shoppers Drug Mart, that would be here in Canada, or a CVS or a Walgreens, and not have makeup that matches your skin tone, or not have hair care products to do your hair and things like that? So we've always had to create our own way alongside what is happening. And when society creates things, they don't create things with us in mind first. We're always an afterthought, and there's always a catch up, or we always have to do it for ourselves. So I come from a long lineage of strong folks who have pushed forward. Another cultural reference of Black women stepping up and stepping into leadership roles would be Shirley Chisholm, which is the first Black woman to run for the nomination of the Democratic Party. And I believe it was in the early 70s or the late 60s. My American history is not the greatest, but I do know those important figures that have inspired me. And as a little side note, they might not know, because I'm always like wanting to rep for Barbados, Shirley Chisholm's family is also from Barbados. So I come from a long lineage of people who will step up when they see injustice. So I always felt when I was in yoga spaces and in wellness spaces and looking out around me and not seeing people that look like me, or seeing people who had, physical challenges, physical disabilities, people practicing with disabilities, not being recognized or helped or seen, I thought, this is not the point of yoga. And as we attach yoga to wellness, who are we not seeing in wellness spaces? People who historically have been excluded from a lot of the things that could help our population. So I made it my goal, my mission, my accidental step into activism to make spaces more equitable, to make spaces more inclusive, to ask people, who's missing from these spaces, and what can we do to change that narrative? What can we do to make these spaces feel equitable to all? And so when I look at yoga spaces now, or wellness spaces now, we're a lot more conscious of who's not there, but we have a long way to go in terms of making these spaces feel equitable and safe for all of us. So I'm actually going to jump into my slide presentation. Don't worry, it won't be the joke I made before. Don't worry, it won't be a death by PowerPoint, but I do want to share with you some information around creating diversity, some of the things where we leave out populations of color and Black people in particular in spaces that can greatly benefit all of us. So we're going to look at the principles of diversity and equity. And I spoke a little bit before about removing the word inclusion. And I'm going to tell you why I remove the word inclusion. I had like a self-study moment, a moment where I'm like, okay, what does it mean to be included? It means that there's a group that decides, somebody decides that you are to be included in a group, right? I think of it, when I think of the word inclusion in public spaces, I think about standing in line at a very busy club where there's a door person at the door, and they're deciding who gets to come into the club. I'm going to include you, and I'm going to include you, and I'm going to exclude you. So there still has a power differential or a power shift in the word inclusion. I think a better word is equity or equitable. How do we make spaces where everybody feels welcome to come in and take what they need, or are provided with what they need in order to have an equal experience, right? Equity is getting what you need in order to level the playing field. When we talk about being equal, equals everybody gets the same thing, but everybody might not need the same thing, right? So we want to create spaces that are equitable, because an equitable space will include everyone, and we won't have to use the word inclusion. We can default to the word equitable because we're creating a space where anybody can come in and get what they need in order to participate. And I think that's what needs to happen in the world. Equitable spaces need to be created. And in order to get to equitable spaces, we have to do a little bit of self-study, and we have to look at what we believe, how we show up in the world, how we treat others, where our empathy lies, and we have to create empathy for ourselves first in order to see the empathy, or have empathy to see the humanity in others. And I think a lot of what we've been taught through the patriarchy, through capitalism, through bias and racism, through bigotry, a lot of what we have been taught is fear, exclusion, and division. Those are things that are, I think, fueled a lot by fear, right? And we need to get over our fear. We need to look at what we're afraid of. We need to access what the actual problems are. We need to look at our own behavior and accountability. And unfortunately, we have to look back at history. Denying history and limiting history and banning books and not talking about what happened in the past is detrimental to learning in the future. We learn from our mistakes. We learn from what history teaches us. It gives us the tools to be better people, right? As a person who took a political science degree and minored in history, it's important to know the truth of who we are so that we can use those truths to create growth and understanding and develop skills for a more equitable future. So that was my soapbox moment. Thanks. I always say thanks for coming to my TED Talk, but I'm here actually doing a talk. So when I first came to the yoga space, I was looking at what was happening in yoga and wellness spaces and what were the social implications of mainstream yoga and wellness culture. So when I came to that space, it was very homogeneous. And for a long time, we saw publications like Yoga Journal or mainstream fitness or wellness publications like Women's Health really only feature one particular demographic of people. And mostly it was women, young women, able-bodied women, cisgender women, heteronormative stereotypes of women as their target market. So when I first came into the yoga space or the commercial yoga space, we had teachers that all looked the same, right? We had teachers that had similar body types. We had teachers who were hypermobile. We had teachers who had very athletic bodies. And I was thinking to myself, as a person in a plus size body, I was never going to be able to practice in a way that was being taught. It was a very physical practice. And it was very clear to me that only certain people were invited into the space. When I stepped into the space as a bigger bodied Black woman, I was often asked, have you practiced yoga before? Or have you been to the beginner class? Or maybe you should go to the karma class. And often, if you're familiar with yoga, often karma classes are classes that are deeply discounted, taught by teachers in training in order to create this idea of accessibility, that we're opening space to everyone from say a lower socioeconomic group because we're offering these discounted classes. And often these discounted classes or options to participate in wellness are at very inconvenient times, are taught by people who might not have enough skill because they're very new to teaching to be able to accommodate folks who might be coming to classes with physical challenges, differing abilities, and possibly disabilities. And when you put a new teacher in a position like that, it doesn't leave for somebody to leave with confidence when you come into a class and somebody does not know how to create a variation or how to modify a pose in order for you to feel included. And there is nothing more disheartening than to sit in a yoga class or be in a wellness space and watch everybody else's needs get met and you get left out, especially as a person of color, especially as a Black person, because that happens all the time. And you present these spaces up as wellness spaces, but then you're ignored in those spaces. So then that compounds your inability to access wellness. So when I came into the wellness space, this is a lot of the imagery that I would see. Okay, to me, this is super performative. This is not what yoga is about. This is completely marketing. Am I slightly jealous that this person can do this forearm stance? Maybe a little bit more than slightly jealous. But when you market yoga like that, who's going to show up? Right? And what you don't know about this particular person is quite possibly they're a dancer or a gymnast or have some kind of training that allows them to do this kind of pose without even practicing or have had, years of practice. Because a lot of times people who are attracted to teaching yoga may have, or in the past, what I have noticed, have other modalities in their background. And it really speaks to them because it's something that their body's familiar with. The amount of yoga teachers that I have met that were dancers and gymnasts and figure skaters who had kind of a movement background already, who were attracted to this practice because it felt familiar, it was healing for them, who turned out to be yoga teachers who didn't know how to teach yoga to folks who A, don't look like this, who B, can't do these poses, or want to do these poses. And for a long time, the yoga that was being taught in my community was very much performative like this. And what I would love to see is more pictures of just everyday people doing yoga in a chair, seated on the floor, doing poses that don't look like this, because this makes for a misrepresentation of what yoga is. This is very performative in its asana or postural yoga. So what happens when you do a Google search? And I did this Google search today of yoga teachers. It took me a very long time. It's getting better. It took me a very long time to find a great cross section of folks doing yoga. If you look at these pictures that were very much just the first page of Google, this is the first slide of Google, this is very much what I would see. Not myself, not a plus size person, certainly not a South Asian person whose culture this actually is, whose culture in a lot of ways that we're appropriating through the yoga practice. We see very much the same kind of person doing a yoga practice. This is the first time that I've done a Google search, probably in the last decade, where I've actually seen a woman of color in the Google search. So that's when I say it's getting better, but you can see the representation is still very small. Out of possibly 20 pictures or more, there's one, right? And it's a very able-bodied representation of yoga, okay? So then you can do a Google search and check it out for yourself. And then when we're looking, and that was yoga teachers, when we were looking at yoga, again, I see two women of color in this one, which was a big, what appears to be two women of color, which was a big departure. I'm still not seeing bodies with disabilities, right? I'm still not seeing South Asian people represented in these photos. I'm still seeing a very white, cisgendered representation, very ableist representation of yoga. Like this, four slides in, I'm looking at that shoelace pose. I'm looking at a lot of things which are very inaccessible to lots of folks. And this is what the image of yoga is. So then when you see this out in the world, it doesn't inspire you to want to try yoga. Often when I meet new students or I tell people I'm a yoga teacher, first of all, they're surprised because I'm in a plus size body. Second of all, they're surprised because I'm a woman of color and maybe they've never had a practice with a Black woman or a woman of color or a person of color, right? They've never had that experience before because this is the predominant stereotype of what yoga looks like. And we move it away from being a modality for self-study and self-learning and connection with others into a performative practice or a performative calisthenics practice with no connection to its origins, with no connection to humanity, that looks anything different than what is idealized by beauty standards. And I'm hoping that, in the 10 years that I've been doing social justice work, can you believe this? The 48 years that I've been practicing and the 35 years I've been teaching, it is only in the past decade, and I would really say only in the past 5 years, that we've seen more representation, that we've seen the rise of people like Jessamine Stanley, who's a yoga in a much larger body. You might be familiar with her. She's on the front of Self magazine this month, and she caught the ire of Donald Trump Jr., and there was a lot of horrible things said about her body. She's in a plus size body representing what wellness looks like, what health looks like at every size. And so it's only been very recently that we've even paid attention. And what is really surprising is in a practice like yoga, Consciousness is what we are trying to achieve. And if you are not even conscious of looking around the room and not seeing anybody different than you, then this is a problem. And where is that consciousness missing you as well in your everyday life? When you look at your peer group, when you look at your friend group, does everybody look like you? Does everybody have the same experience of life as you? Because if that's true, it's a very, very narrow and limited expression, or what's the word I'm looking for? A little bit of brain fart. I'm going to take a sip here. Experience, that's the word, of life. You want to broaden your friend group. You want to broaden your experiences so that you can have a full experience of humanity, so that you can see the world not only through your own lens, but the lens of others. And when you see the world through the lens of others, it makes it so much easier to stand up for what is right. Because when something doesn't affect you, it tends to be in the rearview mirror. I'll give you an example. I don't know anybody with autism. I don't have a good friend who has an autistic child. So my understanding of autism is only limited to what I see on TV and what conversations I hear that might be going on around me. Now, if I had a friend who had a child with autism, or I had a friend who was autistic, my understanding of autism would be so much greater. The same could be said for anything. I once did a talk at Princeton University on this very thing. And I remember when I went to Princeton, it was prior to the pandemic, they sent a car for me, and I was talking to the driver as he was taking me to Princeton, and he was talking about how he was Black, and this is important to the story. He was talking about how it was important for him to have his children see all kinds of different folks, because he didn't want his children to be going out into the world and staring at people who didn't look different from them, or who looked different from them, because they never had an experience of being around someone who was different. So he lived in a very much a Black community, an African American community, but he made a point of it, enrolling his kids in activities where there would be kids of all kinds of backgrounds. And he made it a point of engaging with people who just look different. And so that was, I think, very important for him to have a well-rounded child, because often when I live in a very white neighborhood, in a very white community, which is actually changing all the time, which is very exciting. Often my children would go into grocery stores and other little kids would stare at them because they had never seen a Black person before. And my son, when he was very young, would always say to me, I just hate it when people constantly stare at me. And I would say things like, it's because you're so good looking, or whatever it is. And finally, I just got irritated and just said to him out loud enough for whoever was staring at him, or loud enough for whoever's parents were around the child who was staring at him. I go, isn't it unfortunate? He's staring at you because he's never seen anybody who looks like you before. And that just goes to show you how limited his experience of life is if you're the first person he's seeing in 2015 or whenever it was. And I think it's really interesting that we self-segregate, and that people can walk around the world without having a Black friend, right? Without having a friend from a different culture, nationality, ethnicity, and I put race in quotations because race is a social construct, right? So I think it's interesting that we can insulate ourselves, or white folks can insulate themselves from having any experiences with people who look different from them, and then never really understand what it's like to walk through the world with a racialized identity, even though whiteness is a racialized identity. So I think it's really important that if we want to truly understand and come together with folks, that we have to diversify our friend groups. We have to encourage our children, if we have children, to be out in the world and have different experiences. Because if we only have the same experience, we miss out on so much. We miss out on an opportunity to learn about ourselves, to learn something new, to be in community, to come to that word of yoga, which means to yoke, which means to be in unity and community with each other. All right. So this is the first time that we see yoga, the mother of Western yoga. It kind of hurts my feelings a little bit, because I always think the mother of Western yoga should be a South Asian woman. This is Indira Devi. She's one of the students who sat at the foot of Krishnamacharya, who's the, I would say, great-grandfather of modern day yoga. From Krishnamacharya comes Mr. Iyengar, Pattabhi Jois, all the modern day interpretations of yoga started with Krishnamacharya. Now, I don't have a whole like 6 hours to give you the whole history on that, or like, oh, that could be a whole course in and of itself. But she was a socialite that lived in India. She was a rich woman who came from Europe, who lived in India and was really interested in Indian culture. And as you see her sitting there, I often ask myself, was she invited to wear a sari? Was she invited into Indian culture? Or was it something that was interesting to her? So you get to wear it like a costume. You get to take on this persona. And this is the first person that we see that we attach beauty to yoga. She opened a yoga studio in Southern California that catered to yoga for celebrities under the guise of staying young and beautiful. And this is the first time we see that connection to yoga being about staying young, being beautiful, having a certain physique. And it starts right here with the mother of Western yoga. And again, this could be a whole topic in and of itself. So I'm just touching on these things because I only have an hour and I want to leave time for questions. So I was going to play this video, but I think it's going to be a little too long. So this was the 10 best yoga instructors on YouTube for 2021. I didn't make the cut because I don't have 1 million followers on YouTube. What was really interesting to me is if you want to go through and watch this video later, especially because you're streaming on YouTube, I want you to watch this. Here's your homework for this session, because I don't have time to play the whole thing because it won't leave time for questions. Go and find the top 10 yoga teachers in the world according to YouTube and see what they all have in common. See if you can figure out what they all have in common, especially number 1. So that's something to do for a little bit of self-study. Okay, so I'm going to pause here before we get into a really deep topic and see if there's any questions. There might not be any. You can always wait till the end.
I do have a couple, Diane, or you know, if you would rather, we can wait till the end too, because I love what you're doing.
Okay, do you want me to wait till the end then? Do you think, yeah, just remind me at the end. Okay, cool. We'll keep going. And then I'm gonna, I'll give us like 10 minutes for questions at the end. That seems like a good amount of time, I hope. All right. White supremacy in yoga and wellness. This is always a hot button topic. So this is an article that was written by a friend of mine, Anusha Warjaka Kumar, and she wrote about, we need to talk about the rise of white supremacy in yoga. And from where I sat in my whole Western yoga career, it's always been a very white space for me. I can't tell you how many of my Black friends would say to me, you do yoga? Isn't that for white folks? And I'd be like, it's for anybody with a body. It's for anybody who can take a breath, right? And it was really hard to sell my Black friends and my friends of color to come to a yoga class because we were always meant to feel like we didn't belong, which flies in the face of what yoga is about. So here's some of the things, or some of the ways white supremacy shows up in yoga spaces. So Black Lives Matters versus All Lives Matters. I cannot tell you how many yoga studios do not participate with learning about other cultures or creating unity or talking about major incidents that happen in the world that impact people who look different from them, who impact Asian people or South Asian people or Black people. I can't tell you how many yoga folks I have met who are part of the All Lives Matter, which in and of itself is a very disrespectful and racist way to put racist ways to look at the All Lives Matter movement. Of course, all lives matter. We are all fully aware that all lives matter, but all lives are not the lives that are being oppressed. All lives are not the ones who are having their voting rights curtailed. All lives are not the people who are being murdered by police in the street, right? All lives are not like Ahmaud Arbery, who was running through a neighborhood and folks in the neighborhood didn't think he belonged. And because they felt he didn't belong, they murdered him in cold blood. That's not happening to everybody, That's happening to Black lives, right? So all lives can't matter until Black lives matter. And I think what people don't understand is the term Black Lives Matters is Black Lives Matter too. Our contributions are valid. So if you're looking at African-American history, we all know who Rosa Parks is, right? We all know who Malcolm X is. We all know who Martin Luther King Jr. is, right? But do we know the name of the man who invented the refrigerated truck that brings ice cream to your store? If you've ever eaten ice cream or anything from a dairy case in your life, a Black person created the technology for that to happen. If you've ever ridden an elevator and you pushed the button and the doors came open, a Black person created an automatic elevator door. If you've ever stopped at a stoplight, a Black person created the stoplight. If you've ever been at a party and participated in a super soaker with those big super soaker spray guns, a Black person created that. Have you ever used a GPS on your phone or in your car? A Black person created that. And not being represented or seen for the inventions that we create. Especially in Black History Month, we seem to platform the biggest voices, which I don't think is a problem, but I also think we need to look at the totality of how Black people have influenced culture. Do you like jazz music? Do you like rock and roll? Do you like dance music? That all is created by Black folks. And it's time to recognize that we are a fundamental part of culture, and we are not a problem for white folks. Ignorance is a problem. In what not knowing the contributions that Black folks make to culture, to the world. Another way that white supremacy shows up in wellness and yoga spaces is no South Asian representation. When was the last time you practiced with a South Asian teacher? Okay. Or BIPOC representation. The very dangerous anti-vaccination movement and QAnon has found its roots in misinformation. QAnon especially was created on a dark web and is managed by white nationalists and white supremacists. Now, I understand people have their hesitancy about vaccinations. Black people have their hesitancy about vaccinations because historically, we have been used as the guinea pigs. And if you don't know about the Tuskegee experiments, if you don't know how modern day gynecology happened, these are things you need to read about. These are things you need to educate yourself on. There's a whole group of people who have a right to be nervous about vaccination because we have been the guinea pigs, we have been lied to. But the anti-vaccination movement comes very much from a time when vaccines were not safe. At the time when the polio vaccine was created, when I believe it was 1 in 100,000 or 5 in 100,000 people died from that vaccination because of improper storage and it's late for me, so my brain's not working. Improper storage and sanitary reasons where we weren't administering the vaccine properly, okay? Billions of people have gotten vaccines safely. We know vaccines work and we know they work for COVID. Accessibility, right? Putting forth a very ableist view that there is one way to do anything, that is rooted in white supremacy. Saying things like yoga is not political, good vibes only. Your body is political. Participating in politics means that you care about your community, because politics decides where grocery stores go in your city. Politics decides where stop signs go. Politics decides where schools go in your city, what food shows up on your grocery shelves, okay? Everything is political. Cultural appropriation, reducing yoga and indigenous practice of well-being down to a commercial and to a thing that you can sell, to a commodity, and not acknowledging where this comes from. The fact that we've seen only one type of person in yoga and wellness forever, that everybody else is an afterthought, that everything is made for the dominant culture and everybody else is an afterthought. And when cultures outside of the dominant culture create spaces for themselves because they're excluded, then we hear like, oh, you're exclusionary or you're reverse racist. That's not how that works. Reverse racism is not a thing. And then we can talk more on that after. Focusing on asana only, breaking down yoga to its calisthenics, only the movement base, and not acknowledging that there's a whole philosophy about it, and not speaking up about injustice or speaking up about injustice when it serves you. Not doing it because it's good for humanity, but doing it for personal gain. What do I get out of it? How can I commercialize? How can I cash in on it? How can I commodify this moment of injustice? How do I put myself first and look like I'm doing the right thing instead of doing the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing? Okay. This is what I'm talking about, racism versus bigotry. And I'll probably end on this point because I want to leave time for questions. What is the difference between racism and bigotry? Racism is a power structure. Okay, it's a structural thing that keeps a particular group of people down based on their skin color. Like historically, it would be redlining, right? When the government outlined certain neighborhoods where people of color lived and it was harder to get a mortgage. And that's an example of structural racism. Another example of structural racism would be the school to prison pipeline. How certain kids get stiffer penalties for doing the same thing as white kids do. The disparity in prison sentences between Black folks and white folks, okay? It is a system of power, people's access to medical attention. We know that COVID kills Black folks more at a higher rate than it kills white folks. Access to generational wealth, access to jobs. This is structural racism. This is well documented, okay? But anybody can be a bigot. A bigot has no power. I can run around saying I hate this person and that person, this person and that person. I have no power to influence their life or limit their ability to get resources. I'm just being a bigot. But when you have power to influence or to oppress another group of people based on your belief system, that is racism. So how do we dismantle these ideas? I spoke about it before. We do our own self-study. We diversify our friend groups. We look for opportunities to right a wrong. And I call these microaggressions versus micro-reparations. Meaning, when you have an opportunity to do the right thing for a person of color or to create equity for a person from a historically excluded group, that you step up and do it, no matter how small it is. No matter how small it is, you speak out. I have a friend who has young children at the school, and she does not go to the school and make a big deal when her child is left out of something unless it affects more than her child. Because she knows as a mother with the privilege of being at home that she can go to the school and volunteer for things, and she can go to the school and complain about things that aren't working for her child. Whereas another parent who might not have that freedom, who might not have that economic freedom, who needs the after-school daycare, doesn't have the same ability to come to the school and speak to the school board or to the PTA about what's going on with their kid. So she advocates for those moms that are often women of color. She advocates for those moms. She has the time and the resources and the privilege to go to the school and speak on behalf of somebody or speak for somebody else who can't be there to speak for themselves. Platform people who look different from you. Buy books. Don't always think that Black people owe you their free labor. Okay, the worst thing that I always hear is like, I want to pick your brain, because that's asking for free labor. You're asking me to do something for you that you would pay somebody else to do who didn't look like me. So micro reparations can be about showing up in the smallest of ways. In the smallest of ways, in order to create an equitable experience for all of us. Now, I have I don't know, 26 slides in this presentation, but I think this is as far as I'm going to get tonight, because I do want to open the floor for questions. So how do we dismantle these ideas? We do our deep self-study. We study the history that happened before us, and we use the history to create tools to make a better future. We don't ban books. We don't not talk about race, because as we all know, not talking about something rarely makes it go away, right? It festers and becomes worse. We have to bring things out into the light in order to change them. And I want equity for everybody. I want people to feel like they belong. I want people to be empowered. Human liberation is my religion. All right, I'm going to end there and open the floor for any questions.
Thank you so much, Diane. This was, you've given us so much to think about, and I have a feeling that we might have some questions that come in a few minutes, especially related to, the ideas of microaggressions and micro reparations and racism versus bigotry. But I do have a few questions that came in earlier that we start with. So first of all, we are such a visual society. Can you talk about the ways in which you have incorporated more representation in your marketing practice or across your social media platforms?
Yes. So, when I first had my yoga studio, because I opened a yoga studio, I was a yoga studio owner for 10 years. And initially, when I opened my yoga studio, the only pictures that I could get were stock photos for putting any kind of marketing materials together. And stock photos to this day, like my presentation was in Canva. If I type yoga into Canva, there is no pictures of big people doing yoga. There's no pictures of people with disabilities doing yoga. And there's very few pictures of Black folks doing yoga. So what I did was I got my friends together, I gave them t-shirts and bought them lunch, and I hired a photographer and created my own marketing materials so that the marketing materials represented who was actually in the studio. And so that was my pushback. And also my pushback was reaching out to those companies that create these generic materials and saying, hey, what about the rest of us, right? And then creating libraries and reaching out to my friends and creating Google Drive folders where we could share photos that were more representative. Because if I put out a flyer with the stereotypical yoga body in the flyer, that's whom I'm going to attract, right? People who look like that because they see themselves represented. So I really wanted to have a big cross section. And in both of my books, especially my books, I made sure that I reached out to all my students and did pictures of everybody in my book, because I wanted it to be in both of them, but I really wanted it to be representative of who we saw in the world. Right? So representative of age, representative of size, representative of culture. And these are actually my friends and my students that are in this picture, right? Because I use marketing. I went to different places where that other communities and say, listen, I'm offering a yoga class. I would love to come and offer a yoga class in your space if you don't feel comfortable coming into my space. I want to share that with you. And I also want to train teachers who look like the cross section of humanity, because it's really empowering if you're a person with a disability to take a class with a teacher who has a disability. I hope that answered the question.
That was great. How about this one? How does music or sound play a role in creating a more equitable space?
You know what? I think because music has a real emotional pull for folks, you can choose some really lovely music to help people get into the space. You can also choose music that is, indigenous to whoever is in the room, which I think is really kind of nice and representative. And if you have people who happen to be deaf or hearing impaired, the vibration of the music can also be tapped into a practice. I have a friend named Sean J. J. Moore, who does sound healing with the singing bowls. And he does it online. So you should check him out on YouTube. He's also on Yoga International. Check him out on his Instagram page, because he does these little sound snacks where you feel the vibration of the music and it instantly gives you an opportunity to seek out your own well-being. It's like a stress relief. It's like you feel, it's a tingling of the senses. It instantly makes me want to go to sleep. So sound can be another equitable way, because we don't even have to be moving and we don't even have to be hearing in order to enjoy the vibrational qualities of sound.
Thanks. Here's another one from a viewer. Was there anything when you started looking into the history of yoga that transformed the way you did or thought about the way you practice yoga?
Yeah, you know what? I had a couple of transformative moments when I figured out that it's Jessica Char. I don't think I have his book, but oh, I do. Jessica Char is the son of Krishnamacharya, okay? And his grandson is now taken over the lineage because Jessica Char passed away a couple of years ago. Can you see all the tags in this book? This is my favorite book to read on yoga, okay? Because it comes from like the direct lineage, right? And what really spoke to me is, we are not changing the asana, which is the postural yoga shape. We're not changing the body to fit the asana, which is the postural yoga shapes of modern yoga. We're fitting the asana to change the body. So Jessica Char said, meet your students where they are. And that transformed me, because I could meet myself where I was in the practice. And I did not have to be striving to be better, to be faster, to be stronger, which is a very capitalistic way of looking at everything. More, 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 more. I could be content to be exactly where I was. And this was the book that did it for me when I was researching this. And again, I got all this stuff highlighted and tagged because there's so many gems in this book. But yeah, this book was transformative for me.
Thanks. I definitely want to check that out.
Yes. Yeah. Check it out. Yeah.
And if you have time for one more question.
Yes, I do.
Could you talk a little bit more about your thoughts on reverse racism?
Yes. Yeah. The idea of reverse racism, this is what would have to happen. Black folks and people of color would have to have money and power to be able to oppress white folks from acquiring things, living in places they want to live in. But what people get confused about is that Black people cannot like white people and say horrible things about white folks, right? Or Black people can say horrible things about Asian folks, right? That people of color cannot like other people of color, or people of color cannot like white folks. We can go, that's called bigotry. I don't have any power to change your life by me simply not liking you, right? It's different if I am the government and I can enact laws that can limit your access to voting, that can limit your access to education, that can decide your history doesn't get to be taught in schools, right? We've just seen 2 book bannings, To Kill a Mockingbird, which I think I read in the 9th grade, and I think Moss, the graphic novel that talks about concentration camps. Those things are being banned, right? That's oppression of somebody else's history, right? When your history is the curriculum and my history is the elective, even though those 2 histories are intertwined. I remember when I was in university, I took a minor in history, and I went into the history teacher's class. He goes, I know we're all doing this contemporary history now, and we're talking about women's history and Black people's history. I'm not going to be teaching about that in this class. I'm going to be teaching about real history. That's what he actually said. And last time I checked, I was paying his tuition. So I packed up my books and I left. And I took somebody else's class, or I took a spare, because history is intertwined, right? Bigotry is one thing. A person hating another person for their race, that is bigotry. When you have the power to stop somebody from voting, when you have the power for not allowing people to get equal access to education through the structures of government, the judicial system, and economics, that is racism. I hope that makes it clear.
Yeah, no, that was great. I really love the way you framed that through the lens of power. And I think for those of us who teach, having those frameworks are so helpful to use in the classroom. And I know we've had you for an hour, and I just got one really great question.
Yeah.
If you would
Yeah.
take one more, and then
I
we're going to
will.
say goodnight to you because I
Yeah,
know
oh,
it
and
is
we
late
can, and
again.
if you want to hold any of these questions, I can answer them too in the morning or tomorrow, but I'll answer this one tonight for sure. If any more come up, I'll answer them tomorrow.
Okay, that sounds great. Thanks, Diane. So the last one, yoga is social justice. What does this look like in one of your yoga classes, which we'll, I guess, get to see tomorrow?
Yeah, for social justice for me, again, is creating equity. So the way that I do it in like an hour-long yoga class in a yoga studio, because my yoga justice mostly happens online and through talks like this and all that stuff. But on the mat in like a social open yoga class, is creating equitable poses for everybody, allowing everybody an opportunity by breaking down asana and giving people opportunities to do it in a way that feels good in their body, asking people to start to reflect on how they show up in the world. So I always like drop little nuggets, and mostly I'm asking people to create a path of equity, a path of empathy for themselves, because I really do think the first step to being able to see who we are and to change behaviors that are harmful to others is to have empathy for ourselves, because we live in a world that is constantly telling us we are not good enough, we are too fat, we are not pretty enough, we're not smart enough, whatever it is. There's always something that we need to be striving for more. And yoga in itself, within a yoga class, if I weave that philosophy in, it tells me that I'm good enough as I am, and that I can be in connection with others. And it's that unity and seeing having empathy for yourself, which allows you to have empathy for others. And once you have empathy for others, you cannot tolerate injustice. And once you cannot tolerate injustice, then you will come to action, which is called karma. Karma yoga is action, the yoga of action. So yeah, that's how that shows up in a 60-minute asana class for me.
Thank you. Well, I can't wait to see that in our time with you tomorrow. Diane, this has been just a really inspiring and empowering and evening, and I think you've given us so much to think about. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'll see you tomorrow for a live and in-person class. And if there's any questions that come up between now and tomorrow, we could probably spend about 10 or 15 minutes at the